Good evening. I want to welcome everyone tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Even though there were so many other events in town tonight, we're glad that you are here. And before we begin our lecture, I just wanted to remind everyone, we had sent out a letter, and then it has our schedule for the year on the letter. And included with our letter is our dues request. And we really enjoy everyone in town becoming a member of the Friends. There are 9 of us ladies that serve as officers, and I am vice president. I'm Ann Garrett. And Jeannie Maudlin serves as our president, but she could not be here tonight, so I'm filling in. So if you have your dues with you tonight, our treasurer this year is Shelley Batt, and she's at the table back here. And maybe we're the only 2 officers here tonight. We're so glad to have you here. Tonight we have with us Kelley Morgan from the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites. And last year she became the site director here at our New Harmony site. And previously she had worked in various other places. I'm going to let her expound on that. But she does have a master's from the University of Memphis in Tennessee. And we're so glad that she decided to come here to New Harmony to learn more about our sites and our state. Kelley, we're going to turn the talk over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Who's here for the earthworm presentation? Okay, yes, so you may or may not have missed the misprint in the newspaper that this was Indigenous earthworms. So I would like to address that before moving on to the next presentation. There are no Indigenous earthworms. Good evening. So I am Kelley Morgan. I am the new site director at the New Harmony State Historic Site. I came here from working 14 years with Indiana State Parks as a naturalist, and the last 9 years more specifically at Mounds State Park in Anderson, Indiana. I worked at a middle woodland site, which will make more sense here in just a moment, but we had large 10 Indigenous earthworks on property, and my love affair with earthworks started a long time ago. I have been working at earthwork sites for probably 30 years now, and off and on, not contiguously, unfortunately. But this is my passion. It's also what I have my master's degree in. I also have 2 graduate certificates, one in museum studies, hence the job, and another in college teaching, hence the reason why you'll be asleep before you leave tonight. Okay, just seeing if anybody was awake out there. So one of the things about the perceptions of earthworks is think about what you were taught in school, if you were taught anything about them in schools. So who here has heard the term the mound builders? Excellent, lots of you. How many people here understand earthworks to be burial locations? Okay, amazing, because I would say the majority of people that I've talked to over the years, that's automatically the first thing they go to, because oftentimes that's what's taught to them in schools. And so earthworks have come to us over a long period of time, and they were used by different peoples with different construction methods for different reasons. And we'll kind of go through all of that tonight. But before I go anywhere, I always like to start the story at, and I'm going to use air quotes, the beginning. The beginning changes frequently. So how did people come to North America? At present, there's a lot of different ideas on how that is, and I promise you, wait 5 years, we'll have a few more to add in there. But in school, you were probably taught that people walked across the ice-free corridor through the Bering Straits because the water levels were very low because all that water was trapped up in glaciers. And they came into North America, and as those glaciers started melting, they were trapped. And so they henceforth went across the Americas, populated, and have been here. At that time, It was 12,500 years ago. That was the canonical number when I was in graduate school. They were just starting to talk about the number that I have up there now, which is 18,500 years ago. Things have changed. So, first and foremost, you look at this infographic, you see the ice-free corridor and people walking through and so on and so forth. I'm going to tell you a secret about how ice works. Ice melts at warmer temperatures, correct? And warmer temperatures are closer to the equator, correct? So when the glaciers started melting, they were melting from the bottom up, and so they wouldn't necessarily have been trapped. So we know that better now. But we also know, this is a fairly established fact, that people were coming through a seafaring route. So let's look at Australia, for example. People have been in Australia for over 50,000 years, if you subscribe to those numbers. And I do understand that there are people that have different understandings of how the Earth came to be at this juncture, but this is the archaeological story we're working with this evening. So 50,000 years. And those people, I promise you, did not walk to Australia. They were in boats, moving across, probably island hopping, and that was a lot of what we believe some of our indigenous folks were doing. We do have some proof of that, which I'll talk about in a little while. So these are fairly well known, but National Geographic decided to jump in the mix of this, and so if you'll see the red arrow on that left-hand picture, isn't that a problem? So first and foremost, what's on this half of the world? Europe, Africa, yeah. Did people come from there over here? The answer is yes. We definitely know about the Vikings, but that is way closer in time to us. But when I was in graduate school, we called this red arrow, which up there is called the Solutrean theory. At the time when I was going through grad school, this was the Solutrean problem. And the problem is that people didn't come from European side, but they found projectile points. Now, so projectile points are what most people call stone tools or arrowheads, but really they're more spearheads at this juncture. And we found these very specific projectile points that were only manufactured in this very specific way, and the only two places that they found them 25 years ago was on the tip of Brazil and the tip of Portugal. So that was a problem, because how did they get there? Oh, did I mention they were 40,000 years old? Do you remember that number from the prior slide? 18,500 years? Boy, that's a problem. Well, as you can see now, well, probably not because the font's incredibly small, it is now the Solutrean theory. Because over the years, they have actually gone through many, many archaeological sites and have identified more and more of these very specific manufactured style points along the glacial edges, along the continental edges, all the way down through North America, into Central America, and into South America. So the Solutrean theory now would postulate that there were humans coming to America from the other side of the world that we didn't think we saw folks from, at least until about 1000 AD, if not a little later. But one last thing, this one over here. So we talked about boats, right? We said that they were skirting the ice sheets, which basically meant they kept pretty close to land or to whatever ice turns into land. But this comes from Ancestry.com. Anybody here heard of it? Spit into a tube, you send it off, they send you this really pretty paper. What they have found through these DNA studies is that they are establishing more of a direct genetic link from the Asian islands directly into Chile. So one of the things I love to tell people when I talk is that history is dynamic. Not that the things in the past are changing, but our understanding of how things in the past are perpetually changing based on the information that we are rediscovering. So when we talk about the first peoples through, and this also, if anyone's been paying attention to the news in the last 2 or 3 years, the fossilized footprints in Utah, anybody? And White Sands National Park, they have found fossilized human footprints that were roughly 20,000 years old. So again, and I'm going to tell you this is something else that's very important to know. Archaeologists don't like to change our minds at all. And so we go through this whole panorama of understanding. And we start off with canon. So you heard me say the canonical number was 12,500 years ago. So canon means all archaeologists were there, it's in the books, everybody knows it, you were taught it in school. Then we go to established archaeology, which means that, yeah, there's still some holdouts. Then we go into something that we're going to call fringe archaeology. That means that there's archaeologists who are advancing theories based off information that they're finding, but the generalized archaeological community has not yet bought in to that idea yet. And then there's something we're going to call pseudo-archaeology. And having worked in mound sites, and this is not to make light of anything, but on the daily basis, I heard about the Nephilim, which are fallen angels who mated with Neanderthals to create a race of giants. I heard about fairies, fairy rings. I heard about the reason why a lot of Hopewell earthworks are circular is because that's where the saucers landed, and that impact brought them up. So there's a lot of different theories, again, back to how people came here and who they were, but when we talk about some things, I'm going to refer to, that's a little more pseudo, or that's a little more canonical, so you know where I'm at. When we look at North American prehistory to a certain extent, we start talking about periods of time. I'm going to let you guys know that periods of time did not exist until after the 1940s. So, yeah, it wasn't that long ago. And what changed in the 1940s that gave us more of an idea of where things actually fell in time instead of just they all happened at once? Carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating started allowing us to not just look at artifacts as they existed, but artifacts as they existed what appears to be in time and how things evolved, changed, rearranged themselves. So when I refer to the Paleo-Indian period, this is an archaeological period of time, roughly from the time that people first started coming into the Americas until roughly about 7,000 before current era. Why 7,000 before current era? Well, about 10,000, we have those glaciers starting to melt. And when people first came into the Americas, remember, walls, miles of ice standing sometimes, not that far away from here, where the climate of the northern hemisphere was incredibly cold. Plant life as we know it did not really exist. Most of what we had out there were very scrubby plants. They were very non-edible, and you didn't have, it's more of a tundra scene. If you think about those scenes we've seen with the polar bears rolling around, that's closer to what North America looked like. And people were coming over, and they were hunting. And yes, they were hunting not woolly aphids, Tom Guggenheim, they were hunting woolly mammoth. So, what do you see might be an issue for the people in this picture? Say it again?
The clothing?
No, actually, we have one extant example. Mind you, we don't have a lot of examples at all from this time period, but we do have one extant example that they actually were wearing full-lot clothes. Because remember, it's the tundra. Would you personally want to get that close to a critter that could, and oftentimes their tusk could get up to 15 feet in length? So that means, Terry, right here, I could easily gore you. And so when we start, very few skeletal remains actually exist from this time frame, guys. The earth is not very kind to human bones. And so after a period of time, those actual materials are gone, unless they're in very, very specific environments. So very dry environments, protected environments such as caves, and then also in those peat areas, very peaty areas. So we've heard about the peat bogs over in Europe. We also have peaty areas that do amazing preservation. But one thing that we have found in the few skeletal instances that we have seen of these folks is that they have high evidence of trauma. And modern archaeologists were like, so if we had their job, what job would we have modernly that would give us the same amount of trauma? And the closest they could get to were rodeo riders. Because they had broken bones, they had dislocations, they had a lot of things going on with their bones. And so I'm going to tell you that these folks weren't necessarily, yes they were, getting this close, but people are smart. People figure stuff out, right? So enter a tool such as this. This is more commonly known as an atl. This is a spear thrower. The word atl is a Spanish word. When Europeans first came over and were talking to indigenous people in South America, they were still using these as weapons. And they asked, what is your word for this? And we think it was huaxtl, which if you're a European, you're like, how do you spell that? So this particular critter right here is a spear. And, sorry, I didn't mean to hit that. Let's see if I can do 3 things at once. I'm so used to using lavaliers, guys. All right, so this is a spear. Normally you get about that close to something and you would try to stick it into whatever dinner you were trying to catch. But after a period of time, they realized this was insanely dangerous. So they decided that they were going to fletch the end of this thing, which actually makes, if you're going to throw it, makes it more accurate. Creates a spin, and anybody that knows football kind of has that general physics in their brain. And they used another stick to attach to this and launch it. So LLs actually have 3 pieces. 1, 2, there's the third one. Yeah, that right there. So imagine a time where you were fully nomadic. These people were fully nomadic. They had no one location that they were going back to consistently. Everything that you owned had to be carried with you. And now you're going hunting. Do you want to carry around 10 of these while running after something, trying to hunt them? Because also, when you actually got this into an animal, the likelihood of your point breaking is high, and the likelihood of you breaking the shaft is amazingly high. Remember what I said wasn't around a lot back then? Plants. So this is actually a form of river cane. River cane has been around. It's actually a very ancient plant. And it's hollow, but from the time that you cut it down to the time that you can actually use it as a weapon, it takes about a year. So now, you're out hunting. You happen to have scored your first fast food meal. And you're looking around going, there's at least 2 more out there I might be able to get. So out of your pack, you would produce another one of these. You reload and you just keep on going. So one of the things to put in perspective, why am I bringing this tool up specifically? Twofold. One, people have always been smart. I think some of the perceptions that into the 17th, 18th, and even early 19th century, we did not give the indigenous people here in America enough credit. Secondly, how many of you have found an arrowhead at some point in your life? All right, I'm going to say 2/3 of you, I'm really sorry you didn't. You probably found a spearhead. Do you know how long bows and arrows have actually been used here in this particular part of the country? Since about 500 AD. 500 AD. So most of the things you find out in the fields aren't arrowheads, they're spear points. And honestly, if you look at the physics, the larger points, that's why we tend to call them projectile points. And if we were to put a smaller point, it would actually have a tail drag. If we put a big point on a smaller shaft and use it like an arrow, it would immediately hit the dirt. So there's some really good physics with this. If anybody's ever interested, there is still World Atl Throwing Associations. And I'm not happy to if you want to complain about it, okay? So we take off from the Paleo-Indian period, where mostly what we're finding of people are their projectile points. And yes, these are the critters that they're hunting. I was hoping my little friend would be here today. Anybody here who's seen Ice Age? I know there's a few moms out here. Sid is completely wrong, the little big googly-eyed dude. This is Sid. He's a Jeffersonian ground sloth, and he actually would stand much taller than a mammoth when he stood up on his rear end. And these actually were the not so fast food. These were actually chosen food materials by a lot of early peoples because they are ground sloths. That means they don't move fast. And they're herbivores. So anybody here who hunts knows that you don't really like eating true predators because they kind of have a weird taste to them. Yeah, that philosophy's been around forever. And so Jeffersonian ground sloths were one of the primary targets, along with our mammoth, our mastodon, our woolly rhinoceros, and a couple of other fun big critters out in the world. If you ever get a chance to go to any museum that has skeletal remains of these big creatures, it really humbles you, because when Sid stood up, his head would be brushing the ceiling in here. Yeah, and his claws were about that long, which is why Jeffersonian ground sloth, that Jefferson word, Thomas Jefferson actually found these and assumed that these guys were still alive. And he felt very much that they were predators. So he meets these two guys, Lewis and Clark. And he goes, so I'm going to send you out west. I want you to catch any animal that you find that you've never seen before. Send them back. And he thought these things were still alive. He didn't tell them that. But that's government for you, right? So we're going to move out of the Paleo-Indian period and move into the Archaic. The Archaic period is a very dynamic time, 8,000 to about 2,000 B.C.E. or before current era. So the glaciers have melted. Regional temperatures are starting to modulate. So Alaska looks a lot like Alaska, and Florida looks more like Florida, and Indiana still can't make up its mind. So people are starting to choose regional locations that they prefer. So we start seeing the broader groupings of people start clustering together a bit more than they did in the Paleo-Indian period. When people first came in, there wasn't a lot of population here. They were moving around the landscape and hunting animals. At this point, people are starting to bump into one another. Group sizes are growing, but they're still not very big. These people are completely nomadic, hunting and gathering individuals. In fact, it's not even in the Archaic period that we really see them start tinkering with plant materials. The thing that kind of ends the Archaic period, and there's a lot I can say about the Archaic period, but that's where the sleeping part comes in, so I'm just going to gloss over that and say we find a lot of their projectile points. By this point, ceramic did not exist. It's not until the very terminal end of the Archaic period that we start seeing that pottery technology arrive. And guys, this is like it. It is like the thing. And it revolutionizes cultures here in North America. Also during this time frame, we do start seeing our first earthwork sites being constructed. The oldest earthwork sites that we are currently aware of are in Louisiana. We have Watson Break, which is roughly about 3,500 BC, so 5,000 years. And then the next oldest that we know about is a place that we call Poverty Point. And this is actually an artist's rendition of Poverty Point. That's a 65-acre campus that has multiple rows of earthworks. There are no human remains in those. And these are built by completely nomadic people that weren't living in one spot. In fact, it's very hard for us to even find locations where people even stayed for any short period of time. And the large mound, which you can't probably see, but it's way back up in the very back, that thing is over 60 feet tall. Before earth movers, they did not have the wheel. Before organized societies where your city was any bigger than 20 to 50 people, they were creating things like this 5,000 years ago. We start seeing the use of dugout canoes. And we actually are still finding dugout canoes in very specialized locations. I get very excited when they're like, we found a dugout canoe in XYZ ancient riverbed. And you're like, yes! Because these things were the creation of where people are moving around the landscape and they have to stay close to water because they didn't have water bottles, they didn't have plumbing. And so, but what we see is them staying near water sources to utilizing them into a way that they can significantly move around the landscape in a much faster fashion. Now, I said I've worked in a lot of mound sites. One of my favorite question by a visitor is I was asked why Native American people built their earthworks so far away from the interstate. And if you've gone to an earthwork site, you know what I'm talking about. And so we have to stop and say, well, they were built next to their interstates. The riverine systems were a primary way of transport. Plus, you're still carrying everything that you own with you. And so it's so much easier to place it on a dugout canoe and move it around the landscape than it is to actually physically carry it. With the dugout canoe, and mind you, I'm glossing over thousands of years here, so I apologize, I'm really hitting the fast forward. We, towards the end of the Archaic period, see the revolutionary thing of pottery come into play. Why do people need pottery?
Carry water.
Carry water. Storage. You've been to this class before. Anybody else? Cooking. Okay. So water, yes. Cooking. When pottery first was established here in North America, and I'm going to use a archaeologically technical term, it was ugly. It was very thick walled, which did not allow for a lot of thermoconduction. So I promise you, pretty sure people weren't cooking in these things yet. As they refine their techniques and start thinning out their vessel walls, they're also dealing with something I never understood as an archaeologist when I went out into the field why there was so much broken pottery. I mean, were these people that klutzy? What I found as an experimental archaeologist, I invested in some clay pots and began clay pot cooking. And one of the things that will make you cry if you're clay pot cooking is anytime you have a fire flare, because it increases heat on one side in a very fast fashion, which will then crack your pot. It's very sad. Makes my heart hurt. So we're not really thinking pottery at this juncture was used for cooking, possibly carrying of water, but definitely back to our storage component. People were tinkering with certain plants at this time. If you look it up, it'll be called the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which is kind of a misnomer because there was nothing to do with agriculture at this point. These people were cultivating certain plants in a very highly scientific way. They were seeing that after a flood, this plant would grow in the areas that flooded. Then they would think, what if I cut that down and I take it over here and I beat it up against turned up ground and go away, and when I cycle back through here in a couple of months, there were plants. And then it's like, okay. And so they started as their own scientific experiments, engineering down further and further and further until they get to the point that they understand that the seeds are where it's at, not only for their plant cultivation, but also for their nutrition. Guys, we needed high caloric, high fat material. That was the most bang for your buck. It still is. And so they started having to think about how they could preserve those seeds. Now, yes, you can carry them with you, but you're going to get wet at some point, right? Something called rain, and we had no place to hide from it except for rock shelters. And so if you put it into the ground and left it and came back, well, that's a problem too, because they would grow. And so over time, as they were noticing how things were working, they discovered that if they took certain clays or certain materials in the dirt with high fire in it, would become solid and would become water and impervious. It would soak in a little, but not too bad. And so they started creating pottery to store seeds. And then they found out that if they kept certain plants together, that certain things grew bigger and better and badder. And so we start seeing the very first parts of plant cultivation here in North America. How can an archaeologist know if a plant's been domesticated? Well, that didn't start until after I was already, 10, 15? Seed size. So when you think about what are we going after, we're going after the high caloric value, high fat materials. And so, for example, one of the plants in the Eastern Agricultural Complex was the sunflower. And a native sunflower seed is about the size of a poppy seed. The seeds that we get on our shelves today are over 1,500 times larger. And we see that over time as certain things are growing. And then certain Eastern Agricultural Complex plants went back to nature because people found other things to go with. So sumpweed, little barley, maygrass. I promise you, you've all seen these plants. You just wouldn't know it. And what we do is we saw the seed size increase, and then at a certain point, the seed size abated. So we found that they're not tinkering with that plant anymore. So now we're going to move into the renaissance of American free history, and this is the one that we are most concerned with, at least in this general vicinity, and that is something called the woodland period. So it's roughly 1000 BC to about 1000 AD, depending on where you are in the country. What we see is we start seeing earthwork materials, earthwork complexes being built en masse in the eastern half of the United States. We see exotic trade goods flowing in. Right here at a site that is literally within spitting distance, we found obsidian. Everybody knows obsidian, even if you don't play Minecraft? It's a black, shiny stone. Obsidian is only able to be mined. The closest mines to us are 1,650 miles away, one way from here. Yellowstone, yes. There were obsidian blades being found here 1500 BC. And, fun story, archaeologists are starting to find or have found certain caches of basic obsidian, so they had yet to be worked into anything, that they found, and they were still coated in Western pollen. So when we talk about trading, this is like me asking for your house. And so if I say, I want that for this, you're going to be like, I got to see that. I'm going to touch it, taste it, lick it, make sure it's the real thing. So if we're in the process of trading, it goes hand to hand to hand to hand to hand over that 1,650 miles, will there be any pollen left on this? No. So we have found caches where people have taken this material, wrapped it up out in the Wyoming territory, brought it here and buried it. And why did people bury it? Well, because they didn't have storage units. They just hoped they remembered where they buried stuff. People are squirrels. Yes, we are. And luckily for archaeologists, we have actually since found locations where people have not found their original materials that they were looking for. And we now have genetics and other extreme abilities to look at very microscopic things, and we can see that pollen. So what does that indicate to archaeologists? That at least a subset of the people were going 1,650 miles, obtaining material, and coming back. Now, not all of it. Yes, there were some trading going on, but there was also people going to get it, which is insane to think about. Other materials we had fluxing into the area. We had copper from north of the Great Lakes. We had galena coming from Kansas. Grizzly bear teeth. Guys, grizzly bears have never been native to the eastern half of North America. It's probably a good thing. Back to those two weirdos, the Lewis and Clark guys. Native American people kept telling them about this big ghost bear, and they were like, yeah, whatever. They had seen black bears. And then when they met the grizzly bear, and it took 8 to 12 50 caliber balls to put the thing down, they realized that it was real. Yes. But we found grizzly bear teeth and claws that were drilled all the way over here, actually, within spitting distance of where we are right tonight. So this is a period of time. People are still mostly nomadic. At this juncture, people have started regionalizing closer and closer and closer. So during the woodland period, folks in this territory would maybe have gone on the eastern half of the state. They were Indiana, Ohio, Western Kentucky, West Virginia, in that area. Over here, we were traveling more into, yes, we were still hitting Ohio, Kentucky, a little bit of Tennessee, up into the Illinois River Valley. So folks were moving around, but they were in a much more constrained geographic area at this point. And what we start seeing is a little bit more evidence of habitation sites. So this is a really important thing to know for the next step. How do we know a person has been in any one spot for any period of time? Trash, thank you. Trash. And the fancy archaeological word is midden. So we are looking for midden scatters. We're looking for places where somebody has stayed long enough to leave evidence that they had been there. And through this time frame, it's very hard to find habitation sites because people were still up and on the move. Just wait. So during this time frame, we also see some of the larger earthwork complexes. This up on the upper left is a picture or an artist rendition of Newark Earthworks, which is just south and east of Columbus, Ohio. That is the largest man-made thing in the world. That particular site is about 4 miles across, by about 6 miles long, and there are roads that literally extend from Columbus all the way to Chillicothe. If you were in a car, that would be about an hour and 45-minute drive. Yes. And just to put a little bit of sparkle on top of it, most of those things were aligned with some sort of celestial factor. This particular earthwork, the one called the octagon, which far upper right, it's in the shape of an octagon, but it is lunarly aligned, and it's one of the very few that we know about in North America. The full solar cycle, how long does it take? How about 365? Goes all the way around? So 365 days. A full lunar cycle is 13.2 years. No, sorry, 32.8 years. 32 years. The octagon, as it goes, the moon goes in, and the moon and the sun both do the same thing. If you take a picture in the same spot every day, you'll actually notice that they make infinity symbols, which is very cool. And so you have your outer maximums, the most outer points. You've got your midpoints. You've got the points that are closest to the middle and the absolute middle. And if you add all those up, they end up being 8. And so if you go there on those certain days where those solar points are hit, it aligns directly with one of the legs of the 8-sided earthwork. Kind of challenges the whole thought pattern of people being not smart enough to do things. Also during this time frame, we start seeing not only are these exotic materials influxing, but they're being turned into what we, for lack of a better word, call high art. They are materials, the hot claw is made out of mica. So I'm going to do this. I'll just be really, really loud. Mica, the closest place we can get it from here is in North Carolina, close to Asheville. This material right here was found in paper-thin sheets about this size, and they had been cut into different shapes. And they were moving across the landscape. Mica is one of these very cool things that has a very predictable shearing plane, and there were no mirrors back then. Imagine standing in front of a whole group of people with this thing in the sunlight. That's important, right? Ooh, shiny. So mica, copper, we have multiple things. Our steatite pipes, that's our hawk right there, soapstone pipes. So people were creating, they now had time. Prior to this, people really didn't have the time to do art. In fact, even their pottery was fairly rote. It was thick-walled, it was cord-marked, which basically means they took a rope and pressed it around and then fired it. So it looks like it had a rope around it. They didn't spend a lot of time making pretties. During this time frame, we actually start seeing that shift. And we start seeing materials that, for lack of a better word for us, is art. But for the people making them, it was their family. It was their people. It was their tradition. People just didn't go out and go, I feel like making swirlies today. They actually made things a very specific way. And so for archaeologists, when we are trying to suss through all of this information about a people that we don't have a lot of information about, what are we building our ideas off of? Stone tools, ceramics. Those are two really heavy ones. So we get into a time frame, middle woodland into late woodland period, and we call it the Hopewell territory. And the Hopewell interaction sphere more or less says, we see certain components of religion and the way you treated your dead that was similar, if not the same, all over the eastern half of North America. But they had regional variations. So let's think about it. Let's just say that we're all one particular religion, and we have a way that we worship, and we have a way that we take care of our dead. But then the people in New York do things a little different than they do here in New Harmony. The people in Los Angeles do a little things different than the people in New York. So this is the way we think about this larger body of peoples all over the eastern half of North America. And where we are in this crab orchard culture, and we butt right up against the Havana Hopewell. And these indicate certain ways that people were making their ceramics, access to certain exotic goods and items, the way, what they ate. I mean, even regional variation, I mean, it deals a lot with what you had available to you. So, crab orchard, and for those of you that have really amazing eyesight, you'll see that there's, in that purple zone, there's another green site that says the Man site, which we may talk about in a moment, is one of those locations that we see cultural bleed, not real blood, but cultural components coming in from lots of different locations. But more specifically, let's talk about the earthworks that happen to be sitting in the Harmonist cemetery. For those of you at the end, I only made 20 copies, but there are copies of this map, as well as Lesueur's notes about what he found. They're not long, unfortunately. Archaeologists, to this very day, we cuss the archaeologists before us because they didn't take good enough notes. And I promise you that's been going on since time immemorial. So the earthworks that we have held within the Harmonist Cemetery are of the Hopewell time frame. We have found crab orchard ceramics, and crab orchard, when we look at the span of time, is earlier. It's about 50 AD to about 250 to 300 AD. We have also found a few other bits and pieces we'll talk about culturally, but I think the most important thing, I know when I first got here, one of the common things I heard was that, oh, well, those are burial mounds. They're burial mounds. And I hated to be kind of the Debbie Downer, because I'm like, they're not burial mounds. So when we look at the Hopewell and the way they were using their earthworks, yes, there was a whole mortuary cult that did make certain earthworks that looked a certain way and this is how they use them in a certain way. Most of the earthworks that we see, though, did not start off as locations where people were buried. There is one additional culture that comes much later in time called the Mississippians. By that juncture, those cultures did bury many of their people in earthworks. And they were well known to move around the landscape, and if they found an earthwork and had a need, well, they just married those together, no matter who originally built it. So, one thing that I will tell you, you always cuss the people before you. We still have the same language when we go out and excavate. Thank you, Charles Lesueur. So when we look at this map, it's kind of hard for you guys to see, but you'll see circles with dots in them. That means he found a thing, whether it was burnt charcoal, whether it was lamellar blades, whether it was projectile points, whether it was ceramic, something. But if there are lines in it, as with the earthwork that is outside of the walls, closer to the Athenaeum along the orchard there, there are 6 lines there. And so when I say the earthworks inside the wall aren't burial mounds, I am telling the truth, but I'm not really telling the full story. So the earthworks held within, and the majority of the earthworks here in New Harmony are of this Hopewell time frame. Started construction roughly about that 150 AD time frame. We do not have really good evidence that anybody was staying here for any extended period of time. This was just a hopping place. But what was kind of fun and strange is that there are ceramics here that don't belong here. So there's another culture called the Ellison Lamont culture, and the furthest south that we have found evidence of their ceramic is in Terre Haute. Terre Haute. And we find Ellison Lamont ceramics scattered across this site. So now, another fun thing is that we do find Ellison Lamont ceramics to a certain extent at the Man site. So was this a way station? Was it a location to ceremonially do something before you came or went? We don't know. Check back with us in 20 years, we might know something then. But what we do know is that the earthworks held within the walls of the cemetery, they actually don't speak of Hopewellian construction. When I got here, I was a little confused because what I was looking at did not make sense. Most Hopewellian construction, they made circles, they made rectangles. They didn't pop off with too many other weird shapes. The octagon is a one-off. Every now and again, we had an effigy mound. Effigy mounds looked like a critter or a person, which we see at the serpent mound. And despite the state archaeologist thought patterns and the 25 papers that have gone back and forth about the age of serpent mound, it's Hopewell. Remember I said archaeologists can't make up our minds? Yeah. Has anybody ever seen the serpent mound? Just even a picture? It kind of, there's a head that looks like a snake, and then a little stick, and then it branches out and goes back and forth and back and forth. What we found is that when they originally built it, those coils started right behind the head, and they kept getting washed out. Because it was at the head, there's a big slope on either side. And they abandoned that coil even before they finished the rest of the snake. Like, we ain't bothering with this. So stick and first coil over here. Well, this coil has been repaired more times than they can even think. And any time that anyone came to get a date out of that serpent mound, it was always in that one coil. So some archaeologists about 8 years ago went out and they did core samples all along the body of the snake. And guess what? It's older than they said it was, which makes a ton of sense. But the state archaeologist, Brad Lepers, love him to death, he says there is no snake iconography in the Hopewell Society. And I'm like, oh shoot, I normally have one in here. Like, dude, let me show you Snake 6 Ways to Tuesday. It's fine. So let's just say there's a bit of a debate about the age of the serpent mound, but I promise you there are about 32 different carbon-14 and more specific dating processes that still put it to roughly in that 100 BC territory. I got off on a tangent. So we have our Hopewell folks, and these guys, they don't really look like what a lot of others do. They're just simple conical or egg-shaped mounds. Why? I don't know. And honestly, this area has been looked at as long as it has been. There's still not been a ton of work done out here. And so there's a lot of room for additional research. But, so going back to our earthworks here, you remember the ones I said had lines in them? Okay, those were burials. There were 6. The only issue is that earthwork over there and one right at the base of the bridge are Mississippian, which are roughly 1,000 years newer than the ones in the cemetery. And remember, I don't know if you caught when I said the Mississippian culture, they really like to bury their dead in earthworks. Yes. Now, Mississippian folks, it's also kind of strange. Mississippian folks, they tended to live in towns. And when I'm talking towns, we'll show you the biggest town, but roughly about 70,000 inhabitants. I mean, Angel was getting up to 20. They lived in towns. This was a singular component of like a family farm. Apparently these folks didn't like anybody else. And so they set up out in the middle of Harmony and never left. And buried their dead, and then eventually once that family line ended, it appears very traditionally they burnt the house that they were living in. That's very traditional. And they capped it, and that was the end of that. So when we look at Lesueur's thought patterns, there are a couple of French words on here. So number 4 off here on the right-hand side, it says, my French is horrible, but basically, sepulcre crevé sans, squelette sans sepulcre, which basically means that there is a body without any sort of tomb. It's a random one-off. But the rest of the earthworks that we have seen, and there are more throughout New Harmony, I'm sure anybody who's been here a long time has seen them, but most of them, the ones that had been looked in and documented, that's the word, and documented, appear to have just been showing materials that somewhat relate us back to the time frame that we've attributed them to. This is ground penetrating radar work or electromagnetometry. It's actually more electromagnetometry than GPR. And you can see the shadows that kind of pop up through the cemetery. There are 8 earthworks present within the boundaries of the cemetery. And there's a funny thing, and anyone who's lived here for a long time is going to know what it is. I'm going to point it out real fast. Ready? It's hard to see, but there's an impression that goes around the outside of the cemetery. I heard this story already. I haven't been here that long. Anybody know what that is? Go for it, Rod.
The road. The tourists used to come and drive around in there.
I also heard that was the place that if you wanted your girl to get a little snuggle up, they'd drive you through the cemetery and scare you. Which I wasn't here, I don't know, but it's still a really good story. But yes, there is a road that went around the outside edge of the cemetery wall that people drove on. And it created something. When I first saw that, without that knowledge, I got really excited because it started looking like those walls that Hopewell are notorious for. And then not. So this is actually a picture of the cemetery looking off towards what would now be the Athenaeum. You can actually see the earthworks within, and they're a bit more noticeable than they are today. You have to think about erosion, lots of erosion. And I'm going to throw another fun thing in there. Mike Studeski, who's one of the archaeologists that have been in and out of town and doing work here, when I first arrived, I called him and I said, hey man, can you walk me around? And he starts telling me about, oh, well, there's about 3 feet of sterile earth between deposits. Oh, there's about 8 feet of sterile earth between deposits. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So you remember when George Rapp arrived, that first year was really hard on his people, and they died of insert disease here, very likely malaria. George had the entire town raised. So there is fill dirt all the way across New Harmony, anywhere between 3 and 10 feet, raising the land to deswampify it before they built. And since we've not technically been able to do digging within the cemetery, we don't know, but I bet you in period those guys were a lot more noticeable. So real quickly, some of the things that we look for Crab Orchard, back to their ceramics, they're pretty straightforward. We have some decoration. Upper left picture, the one in the middle on the top, I love that one because the style is called punctate. It's just fun to say. But basically, it's taking your thumbnail and digging it into the wet clay. And what's really fun is a lot of times you find fingerprints associated with that. And I'm sorry, that's just cool. I just touched somebody's fingerprint from 2,000 years ago. But we also see a couple of others. But you can see these are pretty plain. Then we talk about the Alice and Lamont. Now you can start seeing up here on the rims, they kind of have this pie effect, for lack of a better word, kind of a warping effect. They're still pretty straightforward, but we also start seeing a little bit more decoration that wasn't there before. And that's important when we start referring to this location. So I promised people I'd talk a little bit about the man site. The man site, and anybody here not familiar with the man site? Okay, so we're just going to back up real fast. The man site has been known about, definitely importantly, since the 1940s. Glenn Black and Eli Lilly actually came to this site at the same time that they were looking to buy Angel, and for whatever reason decided not to. And Eli Lilly and Glenn Black both wrote in their personal memoirs that was one of the greatest regrets of their lives. So this is in southern Posey County, literally about 16 miles away from here. And this site is about a 256-acre ceremonial site that has those more my style of earthworks where you're going to see rectangles, you're going to see circles with a break in them. It's not super clear in this particular map. This site, hopefully not much further than that in the future, will become a World Heritage Site. This site, to the best of our understanding, is one of the largest ceremonial sites in the Hopewell era and it shows the first iconographic feeders of the Mississippian culture. It's really cool stuff. This is the man site ceramic. So very different, isn't it? It's highly decorated, castellations on the pottery rims. This is one of those calling cards that we see, and we see man, tradition, ceramics in a pretty wide range from here, over 100 miles. And it was thought that people would flux into this location for whatever purpose, ceremonial. This site has not been appropriately studied. And when I say that, it's not for lack of anybody just not wanting to do it. It's respectful of, well, as much respectful of the landowners as possible. The Indiana State Museum has been slowly purchasing up land down in this area for many, many years. And we hope to at some point be able to hold all of it for preservation purposes. But what we do know is when we start talking about all of those exotic trade goods, most of those we find in the Scioto Valley in Ohio. And that's what we call the Ohio Hopewell. And if you talk to those Ohio Hopewell folks, they are the beginning and the ending of Hopewell, and everybody else is just the backwater. Well, we have the same stuff, and it came to us first. So, drilled grizzly bear teeth. It's hard to see also in this area over here, but we do have cougar teeth and a few other bits and pieces, some ceramic. Quartz crystal being worked into projectile points. This guy right here is something called a feathered serpent, which becomes highly, highly important in the Mississippian culture. And so I'm going to put this in perspective. Man site, they said, started roughly about 150 BC-ish and tapped out about 300-ish AD. The Mississippian materials we don't really start seeing until roughly about 1000 AD. So it's curious. These human figurines, there has been thousands and thousands of them found. We're not sure exactly what the reason is. They had artisans that could literally take this material has an occlusion in it that actually has quartz crystals in it. And if anybody flint knaps, this is really, really hard to do. I'd like to point this guy out. Now, the one on the left is the one we found at the man site. That's on a bird bone. Bird bone. And I meant to bring a laser pointer, but my cats hit it. If you look, you can see these hazy lines. You can see a triangle coming down and a triangle coming up and what appears to be some squares beside it. This is a Mississippian tablet that was actually found in the state of Mississippi. You have a triangle that comes down, a triangle that comes up, and square teeth next to it. This character is what we know as the underwater panther, and this is a very documented component of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which again doesn't start until between 800 and 1000 AD. We talk about the underwater panther. Yes, this pipe, this jaguar steatite pipe, came from Posey County, Indiana. He's about yay big. What's really cool, if you flip them upside down, anybody here cat lovers? They have beans on the paws. They show all the toe pads. It's insanely well detailed. And then the big thing over here on the left, that is actually also a jaguar face that probably would have had freshwater pearls as eyes, but it was a hairpin. Again, back to our bird bones. This one over here on the right has a cricket leg. And I'm going to tell you that this fragment of bone is this big. And the one on the other side has some form of what we think is some sort of stinging insect. The man site and the people that were coming and going from the man site were coming to a location that was a central focal point for people who had traveled all the way to the western coast, all the way to the eastern coast, and more importantly, not only did they travel and they brought back ideas, We also believe that we find a very specific ceramic type, and it comes from something called the Swift Creek culture. And we find not only indigenous clay materials, because clay has a chemical fingerprint of the Swift Creek culture area, but it also has similar designs of the tradition, which remember, they don't really play around with that, but made with modern materials. The Swift Creek culture is on coastal Georgia area, Panhandle, Florida. So we were wondering if people weren't going down and intermarrying and bringing things back. So, the man side is exciting. There's so much more that can be done and hopefully will be done as time moves on. But right now, we have a time frame to hit. So we're going to just jettison forward to this Mississippian time frame. This is the last major culture that existed in North America on the eastern half of the Americas until Spanish contact. At this time, corn has arrived. Ta-da! Corn has arrived anywhere between 580 and 880. When it first got here, people weren't using it as food. They were using it as a fuel source. You know how we know? Burnt popcorn. Did you know you too will be leaving artifacts for archaeologists 2,000 years in the future for you to find? Yes. So we were seeing them taking these corn cobs and using them as a fuel source, but at a certain point, it matriculated over to becoming a food source. How do we know? Corn has a very high niacin content, which is one of the B vitamins, and it is highly documentable within your teeth and your bones. And we see from that point, from skeletal materials forward, that it is loud and proud. With maize technology, we start seeing people settle down because, of course, when you plant something, you can't just, it doesn't grow right away. So now you have to baby it and take care of it. And it wasn't just that. It was also sunflowers, which had been domesticated for several thousand years. Curburita pepo, you guys might know it as gourds of some form. Zucchini is another one. That's also been domesticated for roughly that long. But tobacco and beans. So this is back to your fourth grade. What were Native people eating? Well, the three sisters, right? Corn, beans, and squash. Nope, not until roughly about 800 AD. And so when we have these stable food sources, people are spending less energy going out and finding food, and their energy staying and growing it. Also, with more readily available nutrition, they were able to wean their children faster. And you know what that means? More babies. So we start seeing a population explosion. And as I said, some of these towns had 2,000 people in them, but some of them had upwards of 75. And that particular city I'm talking about, this is actually Angel Mounds. This is our local backyard Mississippian city. By the way, Angel grew and shrank several times. So when we're looking at Palisades, I'm going to back up for a second. When we look at earthworks prior to the Mississippian time frame, when people were still fairly mobile, we don't see palisades. We don't see defensive structures. We're not saying that conflict didn't exist, but we don't see wholesale protective measures. When people settle down, on the other hand, you do know what causes human conflict, right? Stuff. We're fighting over stuff, whether it's land or food or it's stuff. Now you have one population here and one population here, and they're not moving. You start cutting down the trees. You start fishing all the fish. You start hunting all the deer. And sooner or later, you're going to have to start moving further and further and further away from your main source to find those things. And at a certain point, you run into your neighbor. And so at that time, we start seeing palisades. Palisades are big, massive walls. And sometimes they were 8 feet tall. Cahokia had them up to 15 feet tall, sometimes 8 to 10 feet thick. This wasn't to keep people in. And so this is where we start seeing a lot of that wholesale conflict. So Angel Mounds, you can see inner palisade, outer palisade, and you can actually see a couple of other lines. It grew and shrank with its population. Now, Angel supposedly ended, and I'm going to say supposedly, it did, by a different mechanism than a lot of other Mississippian towns did. The new Madrid fault line blows through here, and there was a significant eruption of that particular fault. And if anybody knows anything about what sand does when it's put in motion, it turns into something that sort of looks like liquid. And so they create something called sand blows. And so literally you will see many volcanoes of sand, and it leaves massive leftovers on the dirt, basically. And so we see this, and then after those massive sand blows, where people would then start still living on top and depositing their trash and their other bits and pieces, we just don't see it after those sand blows happen. However, the rest of the Mississippian world, we have people being much closer together. We have people who aren't having as much of a varied diet. We start seeing obesity, diabetes. We start seeing syphilis. We start seeing tuberculosis in massive numbers. Remember that statement that I made that we know that people were coming here by boat? There are 2 strains of tuberculosis in the world. I learned this from a epidemiologist, which is very cool. 2 strains. The European strain is a zoonotic disease. I think we should all know what a zoonotic disease is at this juncture. It jumps from an animal to a human. So the animal that originated European tuberculosis were sheep. Makes sense, right? North Americans comes from seals. So we have tuberculosis running rampant. We also have this conflict that's going on. I mean, it's not super pretty. We also have the women's roles start going down. Priestly class starts rising. You start seeing social stratification. Now somebody's in charge because humans don't like one another. We have to have someone in charge. If not, we'll destroy ourselves. Doesn't stop it, but during this time frame, while the rumblings are happening of societal collapse, we also have this efflorescence of amazingly beautiful things. This gorget here is the size of a nickel. The stones you see over here are something called chunky, or what we call chunky. The Mandan people were still playing it when Europeans came over. They called it chunkaki. It was that you roll it and you throw spears at it to see who can guess where it's going to stop, and they would wager on it. If you'd like to see a chunky stone, I have one up here. The cat pot down here actually like yowls. There's a hole in its tail, and so when you pour it out, it very cool. They too also had the human figurines. That one is smaller than the size of my pinky. This bowl is made out of steatite. There's a whole cult of the severed head going on that might speak a little bit to kind of the status of society at that juncture. So when I first got here, and yes, I'm wrapping it back around, Charles Alexander LeSueur made notes of another archaeological site just down the river from us called Bone Bank. And me hearing about all this Hopewell stuff, I see this, and I'm like, that ain't Hopewell, that's Mississippian. Anyone who has archaeology like this much was like, nope, that's Mississippian. And, LeSueur took a lot of the materials with him. Some of it is still in the museum in Le Havre, but unfortunately a lot of it was lost over the years. But to kind of give you an idea of what they may have looked like, and also I'm making some tangible connections. The human figurines, which are going to be like this lady up here, it's the same thing, comes from Middle Tennessee. The large blade, like you see right next to her, comes from Arkansas. The pottery is pretty ubiquitous. You're going to see it all over the Mississippian world, so we'll point out that that one's from Florida, and the other one, who knows where. That's a basic utilitarian pot. But again, what LeSueur was finding is back to those connections.
Bone Bank is the one down by Huffy?
Yeah. And so, when we talk about the location that we're at, I hope maybe there's a little more understanding that earthworks have been built in North America for over 5,000 years by different people for different reasons. There were different religions, there were different understandings, there were different food sources. We track people by very little. I mean, modern archaeologists, heck yeah, go on with your big bad landfills. we have a lot of stuff to be able to tell about you, but folks back then, not so much. And people always ask, Kelley, who were these people? What tribe were these people? And while some of my tribal partners don't agree with my message sometimes, they do agree with the base understanding, is that when we think about this massive, very cohesive culture that fell into collapse, you have survivors. And unfortunately, I say, anybody here ever seen The Walking Dead, or at least know about it? So you have the zombie apocalypse, everything collapses, but you have areas of survivors. And they band together because they're family, because we have a similar language, a similar religion, we have a certain way of life that we like, and those smaller bands of people, as they move forward after this major societal collapse, become something that we know today as tribal entities. The Miami, this is their historic heartland, and I will tell you the Miamia people, they say, we don't know who these people were. We know they're our ancestors in the generalist of terms, but we don't really know who they were. But today, we can find out whose land we stand on. There is a great program called Native Land. Look it up on the internet. And you can put in your address. And it will tell you every modern tribal entity that has existed and claimed this land at one point or another. The Miamia, the Shawnee, several versions, the Kickapoo, the Kaskaskia, and the Shawnee Quapaw are ones that have claimed New Harmony, is a little blue dot. From that point forward, well, we kind of know how we treated history. And I will put this out there. It might be a not very popular opinion at this juncture, but we all heard of Manifest Destiny. We remember that iconic picture in our history books, the lady in her flowing dress and the Conestoga wagons. And I hate to say that the only way that we could justify ourselves is by saying that these people don't use their land. They don't know what they're doing. They're not complex. And so at this juncture in history, archaeologists are attempting to be much more cognizant and working much closer with our tribal partners, even when, and I'm going to say it from an archaeological perspective, even when sometimes the decisions that are made hurt us on the inside. So I'm sure everyone's heard of the GE mound. The GE mound was unfortunately highly looted, and the materials, the few materials that they were able to recover, they were able to look at very briefly, and then tribal entities from across the nation stepped in. These folks said, we don't want this stuff reburied right now. But through influence of other tribal entities from across the nation, the decision was made to rebury it without any further scientific inspection. Which tells us that you go to your favorite book. Everyone here must like libraries. Go to your favorite book and rip out a chapter. How do you feel? So we look towards working towards amazing tribal partnerships, because honestly, there are tribal partnerships that have revealed meanings of artifacts that we've guessed about for hundreds of years. There are these beautiful steatite balls that were in the Ohio History Connection. And for the longest time, we thought, oh, they were game pieces, or they were some religious material, because, we're archaeologists, and of course, we've got to go to that. But the second chief of the Shawnee was walking through with the state archaeologist, and he goes, oh man, those look like what we used to tighten up our water drums. And sure enough, they went back and looked at these steatite balls, and then went back and looked at Mississippian pottery and found that the modern water drums have a very interesting flare to the top of that ceramic vessel that they put water in. Sure enough, there's a whole bunch of water drums out there. So we're still working, and we're still learning stories, and we're still learning that history that was said one way 5 years ago and will be completely different in 20 years. So lifelong learners, do it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer as much as I can. Yes?
You use the term earthworks for our cemeteries.
Yes.
And don't ask me where I read it, but I saw it many times as
So that's a European, that's the European influence. You're going to hear a lot of people call them a lot of different things. Everything from mounds, which is the more common vernacular, but even somewhere in science we've tried to define what a mound is versus an earthwork. But archaeologists, as a general rule, it's like we don't call arrowheads arrowheads, we call them projectile points. We call earthworks earthworks because mounds oftentimes indicate that there were human burials in them, versus ceremonial earthworks, which were used for religion. So, yes. So we just kind of flatten it out. But yes, earth sculptures definitely comes from our European friends. Yes?
Did you ever see the publication that I think was made by General Electric? It was paperback. It was about an inch thick of all the pictures of the things that were repaired.
So to the best of my understanding, that was never published.
I had a copy at one time.
I hate you.
They buried it in Asia. But I'll bet you can find it at General Electric, which is now stopped.
Truth. If they're willing to share. If they're willing to share. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Oh, go ahead, Peggy.
When I saw some of those stone things, it reminded me of spindle whorls. Did they spin?
So, lifelong. Her question was, looking at some of the stone tools, they look like whorls or like spinning stones. And the answer is, while many archaeologists would like to say they didn't, we obviously have fabric impressed ceramics, and they could use, I have done fishing plummets, so that would hold down your fishing weights. They work marvelously as a warp weighted loom. And so, yes, I have to say that they were creating fabrics. In fact, there's an amazing picture that I have of a fabric bag that was from, I think it was about 1800 BC, that was found in a cave in Tennessee. And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. They did more twining than they actually did true weaving, but the answer is yes. However, I think a lot of archaeologists, because, if you're carrying around rocks, you're going to use them for as many things as you possibly can use them for, right? There's not like a specific artifact that they can go touch and say, that's what that use was. But coming from me, who also is kind of a little bit of a fiber arts geek, yes, ma'am.
So did they, it would have been plant fibers?
Plant fibers, yes. Actually, they were not cultivating animals. Like the only domesticated animal truly in North America were dogs. And we've not found any examples of any sort of animal-based fiber. So, not saying it didn't exist. All right, Tom, one more time.
Are there church picks around here?
So the local sources, most of what we're finding around here is imported. So I'm going to go back to Mann's site a little bit because obviously that's going to have the furthest reach. They found Flint Ridge stone, which is going to be Licking County, Ohio. They found Wyandotte Chert. Wyandotte Chert was Indiana's major export. We found Wyandotte Chert all the way down to Florida. So no, there's not, like, Wyandotte's going to be as close as you get, and it's going to be along the Ohio River more towards the other side of the state. But I promise you can go out in farmers' fields and you can pick up huge chert cobbles just right off the ground. It's cool for people who like that sort of thing. Thank you guys so very much for inviting me to talk. And if you have any additional questions, you can find me at Community House number 2. Not tonight.
Thank you so much, Kelley. This is your
Oh, thank you. Very much appreciated.
I mentioned our dues earlier. Our dues go to give an honorarium to our speakers, and we have those 4 times a year. And also we do improvements here in the building, such as the restrooms and the water fountain, and help with digital resources. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Glad to see you all here.
So banner stone. Yep. Slate. Yep. And then I have a chonkaki, squattle stone as archaeologists. Yeah.